if we were to look at our neural activity following every heartbeat we've had since the beginning of this call, sometimes maybe it'd be high, other times it'd be low, but that would just be noise because on average it would be flat, right? There's not a causal influence happening. However, what we saw is very striking, which is that with the heartbeat-evoked potentials, there is a strong linear increase in that the amplitude of the evoked response, so looking at neural activity immediately after a heartbeat, right, within 300 milliseconds after the heartbeat, you see, around a depth of 1, pretty flat, if not even a little negative. But as you go to a 2, 3, 4, 5, the amplitude of that increases so strongly that we have like 140 zeros before our first value in our p-value. There's a lot of, from like Vedantic to Vedic traditions that really have been talking about this for a while, right? Like, listen to your heart. And it's amazing because it's like now all we need is one electrode. We need one electrode at C3 and we need one ECG, and we can blow away the deep neural net with all the sophisticated stuff and get like 95% accuracy, and it scales. We created a little kind of attachment system for the Muse into the USB that breaks out into 2 additional leads, one that we can place on C3, and then the other lead goes and attaches as an ECG right by your rib to get cardiac signal. But that's actually a big motivation for us, is creating simple tools like that can even build upon pre-existing technology like the Muse device and actually be able to capture these heartbeat-evoked potentials out in the wild.
Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Cody Rall, a U.S. Navy trained psychiatrist who's spent the last 10 years working at the intersection of neuroscience and cutting-edge neurotechnology. In today's episode, I sit down with Dr. Nico Regente, a UCLA-trained neuroscientist and co-founder of the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies located in Santa Monica, California. I first met Nico several years ago after his lab was awarded early access to Brian Johnson's Kernel Flow 50 research program, and I later went out there to experience their ultrasound stimulation meditation research project. Nico's team just published a groundbreaking study that they've been working on for years, in which they looked at expert-level Vipassana meditators. They collected EEG brainwave data of the expert-level meditators as they went deeper and deeper into meditation, and then later analyzed the data using deep neural networks and artificial intelligence analysis. During the analysis, they found something that has never been described before, which is a deep connection they found between heartbeat and brain activity that can track how deep someone is during their meditation session. It could be a game changer for how we understand self-awareness, depth of consciousness, and even give us hints at how we can design future neurofeedback devices and tools to track how deep in meditation someone actually is during a session. So let's dive in.
Cody, a pleasure as always. Thank you for having me.
I was so excited to see this new paper of yours come out. It's very pertinent to what I'm doing with my clients these days, trying to teach meditation and different tools that can be used to get to a higher state of meditation. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that too, some of the nomenclature. Some people say deeper into meditation, others say higher into meditation, and very difficult work to try to quantify these states, right? Would you mind telling us about what this study attempted to do and what the design was?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, let's see where to start. So this study is actually part of a larger effort that we may want to talk about later, something I'm working on called a qualia compass, which is effectively a way of revisiting personally defined states of consciousness with greater ease, as opposed to kind of oftentimes more serendipitously stumbling upon such states. And we focused first on meditation and the goal is to permit for individuals to leverage tools that, we can get into later, are designed for their own eventual obsolescence, right? You don't want to have to use these tools at all times. But develop a tool that permits for people to access deep meditative states and get there faster and stay there longer. And that's, of course, right, that aim is riddled with a bunch of hurdles of its own, right? How do you define those states in the first place? How do you demarcate a time series of neuroimaging data as someone's meditating to determine when one state is deeper versus another? And how do you do this all without disrupting the process? So the purpose of this initial study was to provide a proof of concept that tackles those initial hurdles, develops some additional methods, and eventually ends up with a way to decode in real time the depth of someone's meditation so that now it can fuel subsequent work around multivariate and personalized neurofeedback for deepening
Amazing.
meditation.
I talk a lot about this with my clients, but when I was in residency training in medical school, I think that was the peak of the mindfulness wave. Mindfulness was the solution to everything. And they would basically teach us body scans and some basic mindfulness techniques like breathing, and we would relay that to the patients to use on their own. And I definitely think it helped some people, but I also noticed that the practice tended to fall off quite quickly because of this sort of surface level of mind training that mindfulness does without reaching these deeper states that I think can be more nourishing and addictive, in my opinion, in some way. I was reading your paper and reviewing it right before the call, and I love this description where you talk about going beyond the cyclic recognition of mind wandering. So they always talk about recognizing your mind has wandered and bringing it back to the breath and doing that ad nauseum over and over and over again. But my clients and patients over the years, and myself in the early stages, would just get so tired of that. It's like, okay, I'm doing this. I recognize it. Like, where is this leading, And then you go on to say, such culminating meditative states may reach this level of non-dual awareness or transcendence of time and space. And I just really like that description of some of these deeper meditative states. I think that there's so many more terms that can apply, and I'm sure that you had limited space at the beginning to describe all the different types of meditative states that different practices like Vipassana and other meditative techniques can reach. So I'd love to hear in your own description, what type of meditators were you looking for, and what states are they describing that they're entering and supposed to identify during the study?
Yeah, it's a great point, and what you highlight on is us effectively trying to flourish with the restraint of limited text, but also meditation is as the practices that support meditation are as diverse as the effects that come out of it, right? So if you are to try and identify what would be known as like a culminative state that's shared amongst all these different practices, it would be something more like non-duality, right? Where there is a breakdown of subject-object recognition, ego dissolution, merging, self-transcendence. And that also has these effects of like blurred percepts around time and space. So that's why we leverage some of that language as a unifying framework. However, in this study, we specifically focused on expert Vipassana practitioners. And, Vipassana is specifically in the Goenka style of Vipassana, which became very popularized due to the 10-day silent meditation retreats at the Vipassana centers that many people have transformative experiences from. And Vipassana is specifically in the Goenka style is characterized by its focused concentration and applying that focused concentration to discrete bodily loci in iterative succession, so a body scan, right? And we can talk about what that's facilitating and cultivating, but these practitioners that came into the lab were expert practitioners. We have all the stats around how many years of experience, days on retreat, how much they practice regularly, but they were quite expert in this domain. And we wanted to promote the ecological validity of this study. So we really didn't give them a terrible amount of instructions. We told them to sit as they normally would and employ their method of both anapanasati, which is, paying attention to the breath as it enters the nose and exits and feeling the changes in warmth and cold. or doing their body scan, right? The first being to cultivate attention, focus, concentration, and the latter to be able to notice endogenous bodily sensations with that concentration. So they're effectively just doing that as they are. And most meditators, anybody who keeps any form of practice, recognizes that there's a natural ebb and flow to the process, right? You spoke briefly about the cyclic noticing of mind wandering, and that is meditation in many aspects, right? Is the practice of being able to bring awareness to the mind wandering at kind of more rapid successions, right? Not letting the mind wandering continue for such a long period of time. So in this case, we just told them to meditate as they normally would. However, we told them one simple instruction, right? Which is that because we didn't want to probe them all the time. We did in other blocks, right, where we probe them about their depth. But in the part that's innovative about this study, we told them to simply meditate of their own accord, except whenever they feel as though they've noticed that they're surfacing from a previously deeper state, to make a series of button presses between 1 and 5 that indicate the relative depth of their meditation specific to them, right? So it's specifically leveraging a pointer that acknowledges the relativity that individuals are familiar with within the confines of their own phenomenology, right? So it's intentionally to be that way. And we gave them little pointers like, okay, well, a 1 would be something like the more foundational states, right? The beginning the anapanasati, right? Noticing your breath. Whereas 5 would be something more of a culminative state, right? Something more like a non-dual experience, or, in some cases could be a cessation. I don't think we captured any of that in the lab, but other researchers have. So that was the general structure, right? Over the course of several hours across multiple site visits, so that thereby we're now able to demarcate the time series of, because we're collecting 64 channel EEG and physiological signals the entire time, we're then able to take that long time series and label it, okay, this is when they were a 1, this is when they were a 2, this is when they were a 3, by basically taking their report and using it to back label the time periods before they made that report, proceeding their subsequent, or their most previous report.
Yeah. And what exactly were you looking at as far as the EEG? I think I saw power density in there as well as connectivity.
Yeah, so we really, my in doing this, my prerogative, let's say, was to more so identify whether or not we could classify these states in subsequent sessions. So I was almost willing to be okay with the black box with all the bells and whistles, right? So we leveraged, deep neural nets, and we used functional connectivity, effective connectivity, in the traditional bands, power frequency bands that are associated with meditation, right, like alpha, theta, beta reduction. And we at first looked at a priori signals, right? Like frontal midline theta power, or beta reduction, alpha beta ratios, the whole gamut, really. We even did source localization to the default mode network, right, to track activity there. And what we saw is that unlike the ability of those metrics to track transitions between mind wandering and meditation, within meditation, they didn't prove useful for classifying. So we actually had to leverage this more deep learning approach to discover source localized features and their connectivity within these different bands of its own accord for the optimization of classification. So it's a really interesting point, because it says that traditional univariate linear approaches that are useful for decoding, for telling the difference between mind wandering and meditation, peak there, right? They're no longer useful for once you get into meditation, right? Because there is a nuance to that phenomenology, right? That surpasses, the difference between meditation and mind wandering. I kind of likened it to comparing a soup to a salad is easy, right? But then kind of iterating upon the recipe within the salad requires like a finer grain of detail, and a multivariate consideration specifically.
Yeah, not to step too far outside of the study, but this is what I've been saying for a long time about the Muse headband. It seems to better track mind wandering, but as soon as you try to reach these deeper meditative states, the neurofeedback goes haywire. It doesn't know what to do with it. And, that leads me to my next question is, does this signify that either, so you described the fact that these deeper meditative states have a lot of nuances that our traditional methods of breaking down brainwave patterns and, our theories about what's happening to the brain during meditation sort of break down. But does that also mean that people have also very unique patterns, as like a fingerprint basically to the brain?
Yeah, I love that question. It's something that I've been hyper passionate about for some time. Just the notion of, precision neuroscience gets at this. But yes, right? Like neurodivergence is one extreme example, but neurodiversity, right? Everyone is different, right? The brain states that we enter, even to cultivate similar phenomenologies, are different amongst people, and that needs to be acknowledged. And I have some work out around what I call like navigating the Zen zeitgeist, and not trying to put everyone into a box and have people put their brain into states that are defined by group studies and group statistics. Right. And a big part of this whole qualia compass effort that I'm after is only focusing on personally defined states and using those goal states as personalized routes for neurofeedback to get back to those states that you've previously defined. Because, and I think this is a really important point, because I think with some neurofeedback, when you're using the neural signatures defined by another, those may be deleterious neural configurations for you, right? And I kind of liken it to, what you really care about is the state, right? What we care about is how we feel, the phenomenology, the insights that can be cultivated there. I think of it kind of like, holding an orb at this like particular location in space, let's say, right? That's the state, right? If it's a qualia space, that's the state. Now, for some people, it might be best to cultivate that state by building a pillar off the ground and allowing that sphere to rest there. For others, it might be better to have a series of pulleys from the ceiling, right? Because if I am to enter into a deep meditative state, the scaffolding to support that will vary if I have attention problems versus if I have suicidal ideation every time I close my eyes, right? The routes to cultivate that state are different, and it's a very important nuance, right? And it's something that kind of you need to experience for yourself, capture, model, and reinstate. Um, so this, a lot of this work was a first foray into that, to try and acknowledge, like, okay, well, within an individual, yeah, and this is an expert group, right? So it's a little bit more homogenous than, the naive practitioners. But within this group, can we have some relative measures that are meaningful for people? Um, but yeah, it's a part of a much larger mission, and this is the first step. But I
It's
love that point that you made. Yeah.
Yeah, and so each expert, I assume, had their own sort of profile for the machine learning. You were building data for each individual and then going off of that, correct?
Yeah, so for this particular study, which is different than some of the stuff we've been doing since it's a more homogeneous group, we just wanted to go after the first point of this problem, which is, can we capture and reliably decode self-reported depth in real time, right? So that was the first focus. And given that you need, for these algorithms, right, you need a large amount of training data, we pooled across participants in this case, right? So this work is not a personalized approach, but it's a proof of concept that we can decode future unseen states in individuals. Even just coming back to the lab again and putting on the headset, that was the point of this, right? But now, like our current efforts are all geared towards within intra-individual decoding. And a good point that we actually came across is a really interesting way to balance this large data effort that we did across multiple people and use group defined measures, but also still keep it personalized. It's actually this really cool, elegant procedure that we found. So, which, I can go into that if you want, because
Oh,
I think it's
I'd love to
arguably the
hear a
most
little bit
exciting.
about that if you wouldn't mind sharing, if it's not
Sure.
proprietary information.
No, no, no. It's great. Yeah. I love talking about this. So, in the case of meditation, right, or, let's zoom out. So, neuroimaging 101, right? Um, we start we collect a time series of neural data from your brain, and typically, right, we'll show you stimuli, right? Like, here's a picture of a face, here's a picture of a face, and then, like, oh, this is what your brain looks like on face, right? And then here's a picture of a house. Here's what your brain looks like on house, right? So there's exogenous stimuli that's experimentally controlled, right? That is causing a neural response in the brain, and you can identify the neural correlates associated with that, right? Neuroimaging 101. Um, with meditation, right, there's an absence of exogenous stimuli, right? Particularly in this case, there's been plenty of studies where there is exogenous stimuli, like, sustained auditory passive oddball tasks, right? And looking at the way you respond to oddballs when in meditation and trying to ignore that sound, etc. But in this case, right, where you have you want a more ecologically valid experiment, you're not going to be presenting people with tones and buzzes and stuff, right? So there's no exogenous stimuli. There's no onsets of a marker of a presentation stimulus. So actually, as part of my practice and my brilliant collaborator Mihir Nath's practice, who also keeps a Vipassana practice, we were thinking about this data set and wondering, are there any events that would be akin to, flashing a face or a house on the screen? And exogenously, no, but endogenously, yes, right? There's the heartbeat, right? Which is a very significant pointed period of time, right? Specifically the R peak of the heartbeat. So we thought, well, can we use that R peak, right? Which you're getting, for me right now, 70 every minute, right? So you get 70 trials every minute. There's an event that's happening. And so we decided to look, okay, well, what if we just run an analysis whereby we use the R peak as the 0 point, right, of a stimulus onset. And we say, hey, what does the brain look like on R peak, right? Like, is there a neurally evoked response and like an evoked response potential from using the heartbeat as a onset? Now, typically, it's not going to be the case, right? The heart is not necessarily driving the ship, right? It's circulating blood, right? Or more traditional reductionist framework, it's just circulating blood. So there's not going to be a response to that. If we were to take what these are known as heartbeat-evoked potentials, if we were to look at our neural activity following every heartbeat we've had since the beginning of this call, sometimes maybe it would be high, other times it would be low, but that would just be noise because on average it would be flat, right? There's not a causal influence happening. However, what we saw, right, is that when we look, since we have a whole time series demarcated as a function of depth, we can then separate these trials into ones, twos, threes, fours, and fives. And what we see is very striking, which is that with the heartbeat evoked potentials, there is a strong linear increase in that the amplitude of the evoked response, so looking at neural activity immediately after a heartbeat, right, within 300 milliseconds after the heartbeat, you see, around a depth of 1, pretty flat, if not even a little negative. But as you go to a 2, 3, 4, 5, the amplitude of that increases so strongly that we have like 140 zeros before our first value in our p-value. Um, so it's this really interesting measure that, if you think about it, is inherently personalized, right? It's how your brain is responding to your heart, right? It's not saying, oh, the brain needs to get into a frontal midline theta state or the PCC needs to deactivate. It's that your brain needs to respond to your heart. So it's inherently
Wow.
personalized. And there's a lot of, from like Vedantic to Vedic traditions that really have been talking about this for a while, right? Like, listen to your heart, right?
The meta, right? Don't they call that meta?
Yeah, so yeah, metta is kind of like, putting out this loving kindness, like radiating out, but it is heart centric for sure. Um, and there's it's interesting, right? Because it means that in deep states of meditation, you're entering a state whereby you permit for the heart to exert causal influence on neural activity. So then now you're actually building increased interoceptive sensitivity, right? So interoceptive sensitivity is huge, right? Like the ability to be sensitive to bodily sensations is crucial.
Wow.
And even more so, interoceptive sensibility, what you do with those signals, right? Because just being able to be more sensitive to signals is not necessarily good, right? Like if you don't know how to handle it, it can trigger a panic attack if you start hearing your heart, right? Or your heart's beating out of your chest, right? These are typically signs of like panic or anxiety. However, if you're cultivating that sensitivity within a practice like Vipassana, where you're promoting non-judgmental awareness of these feelings, then you develop an intimacy with this interoceptive sensitivity that can then bring about a familiarity with those states, and those sensations, such that when things go awry and you enter into, intense bodily sensitive states, you can navigate that framework better, right? And I think that's actually a big hallmark of what's behind mindfulness, right? Of being able to move from a reaction-based mindset, right, where things just happen to you, kind of like, the knee reflex, right? If someone just hits you and your knee flexes out, a lot of cognitive processes can be like that for individuals, right? Um, and that's because a lot of people react to the way events make their body feel without even realizing that their body is feeling a way and they're reacting. They think they're just reacting to the event. However, when you cultivate a relationship whereby you're more sensitive and more sensible with your interoceptive capacities, then you can recognize an event impacting your body, have familiarity with that, and then cultivate a response that's more in line with your dispositions, or with the way in which you want to respond in the world. And I think that that's a big hallmark of mindfulness, and I also think that it could be now a real insight into the mechanisms behind why meditative practices have been so beneficial for so many different, um, aberrant mental disturbances. Um, and is right at the nexus, because in aberrant interoceptive processing, if there's a common thread amongst all mental disturbances, it's aberrant interoceptive processing, right? It's people getting out of touch with their body.
Right.
So anyway, so I know that was like a long spiel, but I really wanted to share it with you because I'm very excited, and it's amazing because it's like now all we need is one electrode. We need one electrode at C3, and we need one ECG, and a ref and ground, and we can blow away the deep neural net with all the sophisticated stuff and get like 95% accuracy, and it scales much more easily, right? So
Yeah, I can't
better
wait to
method.
see the follow-up work to that. So these influences on the brain in accordance to the heart rate in relation to how deep you are in meditation, really significant findings. Like what are your thoughts on how you can bring that to people to use effectively at home with neurofeedback devices or like in the lab?
Yeah, great question. And the beauty of this is that it's elegantly simple, right? You just need a C3 and you need an ECG and a ref and ground, right? So a couple leads. Um, and we just had to tackle this problem for another project. So we got a grant from Unlikely Collaborators to look at dark cave retreats. So, if you're not familiar, like people go into dark caves for 4 days with absolutely no light and have really intense experiences. So we're running now the first EEG study on dark cave retreats, up at Sky Cave in Oregon. And so we had to kind of tackle this issue, because we wanted to look at heartbeat-evoked potentials, because now we're kind of obsessed with them a little bit. But specifically in this context where you're in a sensory deprived state. In that sensory deprived state, is there more attention to the predominant source of information, which is your own body and your bodily sensations. So does time spent in darkness increase the amplitude of these heartbeat evoked potentials without even needing to necessarily meditate in there? So how do you, get heartbeat evoked potentials from somebody that's in the dark in a cave, right? So we actually, with the brilliant engineering of my collaborator, Avery Beddoes, we created a little kind of attachment system for the Muse where, you put the Muse on and then we soldered up some leads that you can connect into the USB that breaks out into 2 additional leads. One that we can place on C3 with a little headband. So it's kind of like this as a headphone, and it's a headband that has a dry electrode in it, and you just kind of push it down and in, and it's perfectly along C3 if you place the headband, right in front, right below your temples, and it goes up. And then the other lead goes and attaches as an ECG right by your rib to get cardiac signal. So in that way, right, we're training people before they go in so that we can give it to them in the dark. They can pass it through this like double slotted door hole to get it back to us to charge and stuff. But that's actually a big motivation for us is creating simple tools like that can even build upon pre-existing technology like the Muse device. And actually be able to capture these heartbeat evoked potentials out in the wild with just one simple additional electrode at C3 and one ECG. So we very much so are interested in bringing this to scale. And I think if we can do it in a dark cave, people can do it at home, right? So,
Did you felt like you needed the more direct measurement from down at the rib than what you can get from because I thought there was a temporal artery sensor that can detect heart rate in the Muse headband?
Yeah, so that's leveraging PPG, which is infrared. You'd have to do a lot of inference to be able to extract the R peak. So the R peak, right, is typically only derived from an ECG. There is, fantastic work like like Cedric and Arnaud at Brain Beats have done such amazing work around identifying signals like that from PPG, but it really depends on your blood pressure and all of these different kind of assumptions that you don't have the ground truth on. So if you need one ground truth, you go ECG.
So you actually need the waveform, or the ground truth is more important, or both?
Yeah, so you want the ground truth of the ECG to be able to do the R peak detection, because then the R peak is the 0 point for the heartbeat evoked potentials. And if you were to do it with PPG, you can infer it, but then you got to push it back in time a little bit. And that pushing it back in time is dependent upon, velocity of your blood, which is, changed as a function of blood pressure and, all of these different things that we're not terribly confident in modeling. So it's just easier for us to
have a lot of questions as to let's start with I don't know if you were able to collect data in the forms of surveys or just even talking to the experts. Are they actually, just paying attention to their heart, or is it just overall, because when I think of meditation, usually I'm not there just doing a body scan the entire time. And especially if you've got this non-dual awareness, you're kind of merging into your surroundings. So I'm sure it differs from meditator to meditator too, what they describe as going on. So any thoughts there about connecting that connection between the mind and the heart, and how that's translated into subjective experience, or what about their practice is eliciting that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question, and something that I only have personal and anecdotal evidence around, because this finding was after the fact, so we weren't even thinking about this space or asking people about their heart. Fortunately, we collected all the data to be able to do it. But it's very interesting. So from my own practice, what I've noticed is that during my body scan, I actually get a little bit of assistance by noticing my pulse at different regions of my body. And I've been able to get the ability to notice my pulse almost everywhere now, except for my toes are real. I don't know if I can get there. But So I do think there is some element to a focused attention on bodily sensations that could just upregulate this causal process from the cardiac events influencing neural activity. However, I also think that it's something that's more, epiphenomenal, if you will, of cultivating these states whereby you're maybe putting out some of the noise in the system that lets these signals that are ever present actually be felt and heard more, right? And we did a lot of writing and thinking about this, and there's several different angles, right? Like even just from a active inference style framework, right? If we're attending to bodily sensations more and cultivating sensitivity there, then there could be some latitude there that extends to other bodily sensations like the heart, even if you're not attending to it. If you're attending to like things in the same latitude, then that sensitivity should be upregulated, and you're seeing a more evoked neural response because you're trying even unconsciously to be more precise about the encoding and expectancy of that signal, thereby creating a more an error signal that propagates more strongly throughout the brain. So you might be seeing that. We don't know, but I want to do some forward tests of it. And actually, one of the things we're working on now is building effectively a personalized, simple neurophysiological neurofeedback that aims to maximize the amplitude of that heartbeat-evoked potential in a neurofeedback setting. So if we're able to, go the other way around, then I think that there's, a deep relationship here. But yeah, your point is
Well, I can tell you that's what the space desperately needs is more advanced ways of interacting with the neurofeedback technologies. I think a lot of people are getting benefit from the mind wandering mindfulness training, but as far as like personalized, ways to reach deeper states, like it's sorely needed. The discussion about, opening up the brain to these sensations, it reminds me of when I was in Santa Monica with your team and you stimulated my brain with ultrasound. I believe it was stimulating the caudate, and some of those conversations that we had were about, I'm not sure what the terminology is for it. I call it gating, perhaps. It's like the actual neurophysiology of opening up your brain to accept influences, and that like it almost allows the ultrasound to have more of a profound effect on your overall brain architecture. I wonder, if you think of like the thalamus as a gating system and, these other mechanisms of the brain allowing bodily sensations to have more access to the overall structure as sort of like a bottom up approach rather than being blocked from the top down. Is this something that, I think you already alluded to that a little bit. That's what you're talking about a little bit with like more receptivity to like these bodily sensations actually influencing your mental state?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a really prudent point to make. I think I'm not as versed in the deepest of the literature as I should be, to be honest. But I could almost guarantee that there's some thalamic gating a disinhibition process there, whereby you're actually permitting yourself to be more sensitive. And this is kind of seen counterintuitively in I was talking before about the sustained auditory passive oddball tasks, right? And what's interesting there is so effectively, it's these tasks that people will play as people are meditating or mind wandering to differentiate them. And it's like, it's a beep, 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 beep. And that beep, right, is the oddball. And your neural response to that can be very indicative of the degree to which you have an expectancy effect, right? So if you're meditating, you shouldn't really have a terrible amount of an expectancy effect because each moment is unique and it rises and falls and there's no continuity, right? And that's part of what helps to cultivate these non-dual experiences. So what you see, right, in the early part of an ERP in someone who's meditating is an actually exaggerated response. They're more sensitive. It's almost like they're responding more. You'd think almost intuitively that they'd be more like, rock hard, stone, impenetrable, right? but it's actually that you're more sensitive. But what happens is that it tapers off more quickly. So it doesn't actually penetrate and subsist in conscious awareness. So like by like a P300 response, it's actually going down, but the N170 is increased. And you see the opposite of a pattern in mind wandering, right? Where something happens and then you know, ponder, mull over it for a bit. So I like the way that you translated that into the ultrasound, right? Because what we found, and we finally finished like a huge, extra large statistical effort for this, whereby, you know, we brought in experts for that study, where we have really, really strong effect, right? The caudate neuromodulation is consistently and reliably increasing self-reported meditative depth in experts, right? However, when we try and do it with naive practitioners who they only practice for 2 hours of Vipassana practice that we instruct them on before they come into the lab. So total newbies. They don't even have, you know, any type of mind-body practice, no Tai Chi, yoga, etc. And we have them do it. The effect goes away completely, right? And so this is very interesting because I think it's that it's kind of like cultivating a state whereby you are sensitive, right? So it's state-dependent neuromodulation. And I liken it to being at the edge of a cliff, right? And a little push there can make a difference, right? But if you're, you know, far away, the little push is not going to make a big deal for you. And I think that it's that the expert meditators can enter into a state whereby they are more sensitive to exogenous input and thus can feel that push a bit more and reap the benefits of the effect. So yeah, I think you're right on. Yeah, I love that.
I've been practicing meditation for over 10 years, and the ultrasound stimulation made me completely euphoric. And I did notice during the stimulation that, yeah, it wasn't like I was just sitting there. I wasn't actively trying to meditate to a large degree because I wanted to see if the ultrasound would create the state on its own, but it's hard to just sit there and not employ some of these mindfulness techniques if you're just sitting there experiencing something anyways. And so that's what I felt. I felt like, you know, any type of little twinge of mindfulness that I put into the experience, it just pushed it more and more into this euphoric experience that was really, really enjoyable for me. And I think that these discussions are so important because I think a lot of these technologies might have similar effects, whether it's like ultrasound or even you think of like TMS or like, smaller influences from magnetic pulses, repetitive TMS. They affect the way that results are found in studies. There's this question of like, is it a placebo effect? Well, is it a placebo effect if your biology is more receptive to the intervention and you get a larger degree of change? And this is not talked about, I think, in terms of like randomized controlled trials or, because we're always trying to reduce things to the lowest common denominator, but we're ignoring the fact that there is some kind of interaction between the consciousness, the biological response, and the intervention.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's a great point. Like my collaborators and I talk regularly around how the framing of placebo is backwards for me, right? It's almost something we should lean into, right?
Yeah.
And and I understand the need to beat placebo if you're, wanting to take a pill, but it's like if something's as good as placebo, does that necessarily mean it's not effective, or does it mean that placebo is terribly effective, right? Because you think about it, you're able to, based upon belief, right? And this has a lot to do with therapeutic alliance and trust in the system, et cetera. Like trust in general is a big gator of it gates prior sharing between individuals. So if you trust the environment or you trust whoever's giving it to you, then by mere belief, you're able to change objective, physiological signals, right? You're able to change your brain. That's incredible, right? Like we should lean into that almost a bit more. And I think there's plenty of practices that do. And, it's strange that the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater in some of these cases, but, even powerful experiences like Reiki, like what if Reiki is working because you're helping someone heal themselves by way of this, concentrated placebo effect. And that's not a dirty word. Like I love these practices. All experiences are inherently valid, right? It's when we start attributing, with confidence, the mechanism supporting them that people start getting in trouble. But these experiences are valid. I mean, there's so many Reiki centers set up in oncology centers, right? Because it's so effective. So, I think there's something there. And it's a really strong point of like, how can we lean into that and help cultivate states, right?
Right.
Both mindset and body set, to be in these more receptive states whereby interventions are more effective and perhaps require less pharmacological assistance. So, yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah, and we've touched on, I don't want to get too technical, but part of this study and your results have been from using analysis from methods like you mentioned deep neural networks and machine learning. Now that we're entering this new age of analytics from these tools, and I'd love to end with this, like what's kind of the next step in the future in this? How can we use these incredible analytic capabilities to, further us along in our understanding of how the mind is interacting with interventions and ultimately lead to better outcomes when it comes to practices, medications, interventions like ultrasound?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. I have a few thoughts there. One is, the first kind of obvious next step for a lot of this work is both, leveraging or cultivating these states. And I think we talked about this before of like, getting the view from the top of the mountain and then building the tools to get back up there yourself. So, one way of doing that is through neurofeedback, right? Which is what I was talking about before with this notion of a qualia compass, which I can come back to, of basically enabling people to get familiar with their own phenomenological states, know what works for them, know what they want to cultivate, and be able to have a framework for getting back there. It's kind of like building a qualia space, having a specific landmark, and then knowing where you are in that space and getting the right propulsion from your current state to that desired state, and building tools that permit for people to do that, to get these like mental souvenirs, if you will, from different experiences and use them as ways to get back to those states. So I think that's first, is like leveraging these insights of things that are captured in the lab, perhaps with a bunch of bells and whistles, to cultivate a specific experience, but then capture that experience and leverage personalized multivariate neurofeedback to get back to it. That's one approach. The second is also kind of combining tech, right? Closed loop BCI systems, right? What if there's a way to identify when someone is deepening their meditative state, or you start timing the ultrasound pulsation to be phase locked to the heartbeat evoked potentials, right? So that you're accentuating the heartbeat evoked potentials. What does that do? What does that feel like, right? So exploring that space seems ripe as well. And then finally, I think there's this notion of building like neural trajectories, or neural itineraries, if you will, whereby you use one piece of technology to create like a tabula rasa of sorts of your phenomenology space. So everybody's more at a starting place, and then you do experience A followed by experience B followed by experience C, and it's the itinerary that's effective instead of any one particular thing. And that can be done in a way that basically uses tech, in one way or another, to get you to a state where then you just have the experience that's tech free, but the tech kind of like primed and probed you for that experience. So I think those three avenues are some of the things I'm personally interested in. Fingers crossed on some grants we'll spend the next 5 or so years working on.
All right, I sense a collaboration between us two. We're going to have this event where people will come to get their reference experiences. Over here is the ultrasound booth. Over here is the stroboscopic stimulation booth. Behind us, we've got,
Getting the
and
cube, the
as you go
near
through each booth, you're getting data collected in your own individual collection of data to be analyzed by the AI, and it's given to you via the cloud at the end of the experience, and your custom neurofeedback protocol as a result.
That's a dream of mine, man. Yeah, for sure. It's
Uh,
something we're doing now with aesthetic chills, and yeah, it's a whole. But yes, 100%. Cultivate the experience with in ways that don't scale, right? Like there's a big focus oftentimes on like, oh, well, will that scale? Will that scale? Maybe it doesn't need to scale. Maybe you create an experience that's so potent and you just find the right way to record it and give people a little goodie bag on the way out. That's effectively the way to recultivate that experience at home at will. Right?
well, I wonder if there would be a way to scale a little bit. You know, if you had a device at home that was able to induce different states and collect the data and collect it in a repository for you and design your protocols, you know, that, in my opinion, could be possible, but it's so complicated, you know, and how do you like know that the AI has done the person justice in terms of setting up the right protocols? There's so much work to be done. We got a lot of work ahead of us here in
Yeah,
the
man.
next
Yeah,
30
yeah,
years of our careers, Nico.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm excited to be on it with you, man. Yeah.
What's next for the Institute of Advanced Consciousness Studies in terms of the work that you're doing and what we can look forward to?
We're gonna keep following this thread, keep building up this notion of the qualia compass, exploring different states of consciousness. Like, we started with meditation because it's innocuous and maximally beneficial for a great majority of people. But what about going into other states that we want to visit more often? Flow state, musical creativity, states of increased empathic concern for others, more prudent decision making, fostering states that are more likely to permit encoding and subsequent recall. But really exploring these states and digging deeper into leveraging these heartbeat-evoked potentials for neurofeedback. And then, of course, we always have a burgeoning interest in leveraging aesthetic chills as a non-pharmacological route to basically effectively self-transcendent states through these micro-mystical experiences, and finding ways to leverage those therapeutically, and capture those states and build more intense chills through neurofeedback and closed-loop BCI. A lot of fun, cool, exciting stuff. But
Yeah, if people
yeah,
want to, contribute to the nonprofit or, be involved as test subjects, I think that is the newsletter the best way. I think,
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, advancedconsciousness.org. You can sign up for our newsletter. We keep our lab meetings totally open to the public. We also have journal clubs. So, if you want to join, propose something, or just, listen in, anyone's welcome. We try and stay updated on social media, and our blog. So, yeah, if you're interested, please follow along and try and contribute to the journey. And there's a we're a nonprofit 501c3, so there's always opportunities for donations, both for general support and then specific projects. Like, I don't know, we talked a bit about the pineal gland neuromodulation project. We're totally crowdsourcing that one, which should be so exciting. I mean, no one's ever done it, so why not? But yeah, so.
we'll have to do an episode on that one in the future.
Oh yeah, man. Yeah.
Well, Dr.
That
Regente, thanks
one's.
so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Cody. I appreciate you. Yeah, I
All
love
right.
what you do.